everybody. I'm Linda Churchill, the head gardener for the Santa Fe Botanical Garden. We are happy you're able to join us today for this webinar on fruit tree pruning in northern New Mexico. Just a word before we get started, our friend and colleague Tracy Neal played a very large role in helping to prepare this presentation, but he unfortunately will not be able to join us today. But his expertise and his spirit is very much alive and helped to guide us in this presentation. And we want to put out a special thank you for his goodwill to the garden and to all trees everywhere. So thank you, Tracy. And let's get started. Let's move on to pruning. So fruit tree pruning in northern New Mexico. Here's the highlights of what we'll touch on today. First one is why prune, which form to use, tree biology, how to prune, when to prune, and then we'll follow it all up with tips and what to do when you're standing and looking at your fruit tree, like I'm standing right here in front of ours. So, why prune? The basic goal of fruit tree pruning is to create a tree with strong structure that makes a tree easy to work with, minimizes potential problems, stimulates good fruit production and ripening, because we all in the end want to eat that apricot or peach or apple. Why prune? Make the tree easy to work with. For the purposes of pruning, thinning, harvesting, and pest and disease control in the home garden, trees should be low and wide, so no more than about 10 to 12 feet tall and maybe 12 to 15 feet wide, with fruit and branches reachable from an 8-foot ladder. You could see in that last picture that showed me on a ladder, that was a 6-foot ladder, not an 8-foot, and I was already stretching a bit. So you might want to come down to maybe a 10-foot tall tree might be the highest that you're comfortable working with. So think about that as you go forward. The other thing about making a tree easy to work with is branching should be open enough so you can reach all parts of the tree easily. The structure should produce a tree that will bear and be easy to harvest for a long time. Why prune? You also want to minimize potential problems over the tree's life. The tree should have enough shading of the trunk and branches year-round that sun scald is minimized. It's a big problem here in northern New Mexico. We will talk more about that later. Branch angles must be wide enough to avoid included bark. The branch angle is the angle between the trunk and the branches coming off the trunk. Even though this isn't a fruit tree in this picture, you can see this is a very narrow angle between the two. And this section right here is included bark. That's also something we'll talk about later, but we wanted to give you a heads up visual now. Branches must be the right lengths and spaced properly to avoid breakout from fruit load. The tree canopy must be open enough to avoid promoting disease. We want air circulation and sunlight in there to keep the tree healthy. And we want to be able to control the growth that's heading in the wrong direction or prevent it altogether. You don't want the tree to be crowding walkways, growing towards buildings, or too close to other trees, or growing toward the ground. Why prune? You also want to stimulate fruit production and ripening. That's something you can definitely help with how you prune. You want to create a tree with the optimal number of bearing branches, that the main branches coming off the trunk and bearing the weight. And you also want to help prune by help create fruiting buds and spurs. You want to create a tree that has good sunlight penetration to ripen the fruit well throughout the tree. But to balance that, you also want to have the tree create enough foliage to maintain good-sized fruit. The foliage is what feeds the tree overall through its chlorophyll production. Uh-oh. Sorry, my Computer didn't want to play for a moment. There we go. Now on to the next topic, which form to use. There are three basic forms that fruit trees are typically trained to in a home orchard. They are the open center or open vase form. This is typically the shortest of the forms, this one here. Central leader form, which is the tallest typically of the forms. That's this one, looks a little bit like Christmas tree shaped. And then the one that's the compromise of the two forms, the modified central leader. That's the one we typically use the most here, or that's the one that Botanical Gardens advocates using the most. Open center form. This is the form most often recommended all over the country for stone fruits, apricots, cherries, peaches, and plums. It's also used in some areas for apples and pears, but more often you'll see it used for those stone fruits. In this form, there's 3 or 4 bearing branches. That's these main branches coming off the trunk. In this case, it looks like 3. They're developed on a low trunk separated by typically 6 to 8 inches vertically on the trunk and radiating in different directions. You can see this is to the, let's say that's the north, that's the south, and maybe this is to the west. When the tree is planted, the central leader is removed at 3 to 4 feet, and that creates a tree that's low, open, and easy to work with. When you remove that, basically it's about the top half of the tree on planting, it creates branching out below that removal, and these are the branches that come off usually pretty close to one another when you first cut that top of the tree off. One of the big drawbacks to this form here where we live in New Mexico is that it leaves the trunk and branches especially susceptible to sun scald. So in other places where they want all that additional sunlight as much as possible coming into this tree, you can see this even looks like it might have been taken on a cloudy day in Oregon or Washington. Here on our cloudy days, they're few and far between. There's sunny days here, and this tree is getting extra sunlight penetration and creating sunburn or sun scald problem on that delicate trunk. The other problem is not just here, but other places, because the branches are all fairly close together on the trunk, coming in close in here and here, potential for breakout from heavy loads is greater. So that's one of the reasons it's not used as much for apples and pears, because that's heavier fruit. So these branches could pick up all that ripe fruit at the end of the season and break out because of the additional weight on the tree trunk. So then we'll go to the next potential form used for fruit trees, which is called the central leader form. The central leader form creates a tree with the central leader, central trunk up to 8 to 10 feet tall, with 2 or 3 tiers of branches coming off the trunk at 2 to 3 foot intervals. So here's one central tier that's going around the trunk, not just left to right. Here's the next tier, here's the third tier. This can be very productive for trees on strongly dwarfing rootstocks and is most commonly used for apples and pears. So if it's on a strongly dwarfing rootstock, the tree won't have as strong a tendency to grow very tall very fast. However, on the central leader form, it's hard to keep trees that are on semi-dwarf or standard, that's taller rootstocks, with varieties that are very vigorous, small enough to work with easily. And it's hard to keep those top tiers from shading out the lower tiers and to create space for adequate sunlight penetration. So a central leader form, which is often used for example, shade trees, they just want to keep growing tall and wide, and you have to prune them continually to keep them from shading out the fruit and the lower tiers. So we don't recommend it as strongly for fruit trees here because you're just out there with your pruners all the time. So we recommend here in northern New Mexico, especially this compromise form, which is the modified central leader. Here's the top view. This is the branches radiating around the trunk. Side view, you have this strong central trunk leader, which is good at bearing the weight of the heavier branches with the fruit load. But then when you get to the top of the trunk at about 6 to 8 feet, you cut off the leader so that it reduces the upward growth activity, the growth energy, and puts it out to the side and also directs it to the radial branches sideways as well. So it doesn't keep wanting to go quite as strongly upward. So the modified leader, central leader forms a compromise. It's recommended for trees on semi-dwarf and standard rootstocks, especially in home orchards. That's because this form is, because it's not quite so tall, makes it easier for us to work with on our 5 to 8 foot ladders. In this form, let me move this slide. Central leader is allowed to grow up to 6 to 8 feet with 4 to 6 main bearing branches coming off this, separated vertically on the trunk by a foot to 1.5 feet, radiating in different directions. The central leader is cut off above the last bearing branch. Some growers leave a small crown of branches or twigs on top of that last cut to further shade the trunk and the top branches. This crown is cut back annually to keep the branches short. This form shades the trunk and spreads out the fruit load better than the open bowl form, while creating a lower tree that's easier to work with and producing less shading than the central leader form. And one thing to keep in mind when creating this form, don't cut the leader back on new trees. So when you're planting the very young tree, you don't cut it back, which is what you do to create the open bowl form. You let it grow until it gets to that 6 to 8 feet height, and then reduce the leader, the top leader. Having top and bottom bearing branches coming off to the south and southwest adds better shading for the trunk and branches. So that top leader and the bottom bearing branch will shade the area of trunk beneath them, so you get a little bit less of that sun-scald activity happening. So, given those different forms to work with, what do you do about the sizes of the fruit trees? Where does that size come in? So we'll talk a little bit about that. When you buy a fruit tree, you're really buying 2 different trees that are grafted together. So the tree above ground, this section here, in the hatch mark, that's called the scion. That's the part that will produce the flowers and therefore the fruit that you want. And it's the flavor characteristics, the size the fruit will get, how late it harvests, that sort of thing. The tree below ground, or the rootstock, is used to control the tree size and some other characteristics. You can see some of them pointed out here. What kind of soil to do well in, their hardiness, etc. But primarily we want flavor. So rootstocks whose genetics will produce smaller trees. So these are the semi-dwarfs. You might call this the dwarf. Rootstocks whose genetics will produce smaller trees are used to produce some semi-dwarf and dwarf versions of the variety you want. Even standard trees are grafted. So even this guy, standard, which is considered 100% of what the tree naturally would go to, are grafted onto rootstocks that will produce a full-size tree, sometimes because you might want some of those other characteristics of the standard tree, how hardy that tree might be, what kind of soil it would be adapted to especially. If trees are not labeled dwarf or semi-dwarf in the nursery, they're probably on standard rootstocks and will get to be full-sized. You can always ask the nursery staff if you're out shopping and you see a tree you like but it's not labeled. Ask the nursery what kind of rootstock it's on. The person you're talking to, the salesperson, might not know, but you should ask because they should be labeled. Maybe if more of us in the nurseries ask, the nursery people might be more likely to label them going into the future. So, trees grown on the semi-dwarf rootstocks, as you can roughly see from this sketch here, will typically get about 15 to 20 feet tall, unpruned, possibly a little shorter here in northern New Mexico. Depends on the type of tree and the exact variety of rootstock. In order to have a tree that's easy to work with, you should plan on pruning it every year. Standard trees will typically get between 18 and 30 feet tall or so. Now we're going to move on to tree biology. So in order to understand how, when, and where to prune, it's important to know something about tree biology. Trees use energy for 2 things, growth and defense. So because pruning cuts create wounds, the tree must spend energy to repair them. By taking out active growing wood, pruning also removes energy from the tree. For these reasons, it's important not to over prune the tree in any one year. It's recommended not to remove more than about 25 to 30% of the canopy of a younger, vigorous tree. Older trees, like older humans, don't recover as well from injuries as younger trees do. So it's recommended not to prune out more than maybe 10 or 15% of the canopy on old trees. So large cuts take longer to repair and remove more energy from the tree. So avoid having to remove large branches by establishing the basic form as early as you can. So prune more on a younger tree and get those basic bearing branches in place as young as you can. So trees don't heal the way we do either. They seal off open wounds and grow new wood over them to keep disease organisms from invading the tree. So rather than healing a cut, they seal over it. So on this branch on the left, you can see it's a fairly old trunk and has some interesting old gnarly bark, but you can also see there were old pruning wounds here and here. And even though it's hard to see because of the texture of the bark itself, you could probably tell that those wounds have almost closed over in this case, and it's well on the way over here. Also important for the sealing of wounds is you shouldn't use any kind of pruning paints, as these can interfere with the tree's natural processes of damage control. So because the tree needs oxygen to be able to use its cells to do the repair work, if you use pruning paints, that will get in the way of the processes. So if you look at this example over here of the tree on the right, the tree started to try to grow some new wood, new callus wood over that wound, but it hasn't been very successful. Probably that was cut too far into the branch collar would be my guess. Also, you can see this section down here at the bottom. That section was torn off, ripped off maybe when the heavy branch was removed and cut way beyond the branch collar. And up here, it hasn't had a very successful time at sealing over either, so not a very happy tree. So at the base of each branch is a group of cells that will seal off a wound. These cells are contained in what I was just naming the branch collar. The branch collar usually sticks out of the bit from the trunk or the branch that it's coming from. So here's the branch coming down, and this little lumpy area here off of the branch that it's coming out of is called the branch collar. So cutting flush in this case would damage this collar and interfere with the tree's natural healing or sealing off process. You can see when we cut these branches off, this is the same branch, we cut just above that branch collar. So these specialized cells in the branch collar will be able to seal over these wounds fairly quickly. It's a young branch, so it should happen very quickly. So here we have a diagram of, lost my place. Image showing larger branches. So you can see the branch collar is clearly defined as well. And here's the branch collars, it's sort of lump going off from the edge here and here. And you can see on this dead branch here, this tree was doing exactly what it was supposed to be doing. The branch collar prevents any possible microorganisms, problems, pests getting into the live tree from the dead branch, where these cells sealed off that from happening. So doing their job here. And there's a raised ridge of bark also between the branch and the trunk on the top here, called the branch bark ridge. You can see that. And that's where the two different kinds of wood from the branch collar and the trunk wood have met. Branch bark ridge. When a branch grows too close to or too tight to a trunk, that can be a problem. So this is called included wood. This down here, where two different kinds of, oops, sorry about that, where the two different kinds of wood meet, that can be a weakened structure in the plant. Interferes with the connection between the trunk wood and the branch wood, producing a weaker attachment to the trunk. So when this one of these branches, both of them sometimes, grow too long or heavy with fruit or meet with a windstorm, some other problem like that, the branches can split out due to this weak attachment. Pears and some apples can have a strong tendency to produce branches that go out instead of up. So they create tight angles that can lead to this included wood as they grow. So you as the pruner need to watch this and carefully take out a lot of those upright branches every year. That's your job as the pruner of these orchard trees. Fruit buds tend to form best on branches that grow on 45 to 60% angles out from the trunk. So this is about approximately a 60% angle here from this trunk. It's important to control the angles that branches grow out from in order to avoid breakouts and to stimulate fruiting. Branches that are too tight, or spreading them with wooden or plastic spreaders. This has been done on this tree. I took wooden spreaders that you can get in different sizes to spread this young branch out from the trunk, and this one here, they're just held in place by the tension of the younger branches. Doesn't work as well on older, more set wood, so if you need to be doing that kind of spreading work, it's ideal to do within the first couple of years of planting your fruit trees. Trees set fruit from buds that grow on young branches and on fruit spurs. Fruit spurs are these short, stubby, almost branch-like items that develop over time and can produce a good crop of fruit for anywhere from 3 to 10 years, depending on the type of tree. Learn to recognize fruit trees and don't prune them off while they're bearing well. Peaches and nectarines are an exception. They bloom on year-old wood and don't develop fruit spurs. So this is a picture of a recently pruned peach branch. And you can see here you don't have spurs coming off of the branches, but the peach buds are right on the branches themselves. It's just starting to swell with the spring. So they'll bloom on new wood, so you have to keep pruning those every year to keep creating new wood for next year's buds. Branches that tend to grow straight up off a branch are called water sprouts. They will not set fruit well and should be removed. Here's one highlighted so you can see it more easily through the tangle of all the other branches on this. Branches growing down are also problematic as they are often in too much shade to produce fruit or beneficial leaves. They also probably couldn't support fruit if the weight of fruit grew on these branches. So you want to cut those off right at the trunk, the branch they're growing off of as well. Branches that grow from below the graft are called suckers. These are coming from the rootstock, will not produce the kind of fruit you want. They'll produce whatever's happening from the rootstock, as we talked about earlier. They're not coming from the trunk or the higher branches to produce actual fruit. Branches that rub together can create wounds in the bark where they rub. These can form openings for disease infection or for pests to enter. Removing crossing branches on an ongoing basis will prevent this. Try to avoid this problem by observing which branches are likely to rub in the future, pruning one or both to prevent rubbing. Sun scald. Sun scald is a common problem in the Southwest. Happens when the sap under the bark warms and liquefies on a sunny winter day, as we've had a lot of them this year, and expands when it freezes again at night. This damages the bark, as when water freezes, it expands, so it cracks the bark when it freezes. And then the bark, when it's cracked, is broken and then interferes with the nutrient flow and growth just under the bark where all that good stuff happens in the tree. It occurs frequently on the south and southwest sides of the trunk, the parts that get heated up the most in the warm afternoon sun, especially on younger trees with thinner bark. Peaches and cherries are particularly susceptible to sun scald. Along with pruning to shade the bark on the southwest side, you can also paint the trunk with exterior white latex paint that's mixed 50-50 with water. Keeps the bark more reflective and therefore cooler in the winter months. Now we get on to the juicy part, how to prune. You know all the concepts about it, we want to know actually how to go about doing it. We want to start with using the correct tools. Because the way cuts are made is important, the tools used to make them are equally important. In order to make clean cuts, use high quality tools and keep them clean and sharp. You wouldn't want a surgeon to use dirty, cheap tools when operating on you, so you shouldn't use those on any kind of tree. This is a pair of scissor type pruning shears. That's the best kind to use. They make a clean cut where the blades pass by each other. The other kind of pruning shears is anvil type, where the blade hits the base when it's cut. We don't recommend using those for trees. They tend to shred the bark a little bit. They also smash it when the blade's cut, and they dull very quickly. So don't use those on anything but dead wood or chopping up your kindling. The pruning saw is one that's used with a backward pull, as opposed to a carpenter saw where it's a back and forth motion. Pruning saws come in a variety of shapes and lengths. They're very useful tools to have, keep them clean and sharp as well. Most good hand pruners are designed to cut branches up to 3/4 to 1 inch diameter. The branch is bigger than that. You can take this part of the pruner and essentially stick the same thing with a longer handle on what's called a pruning lopper. That gives you a lot more leverage to prune larger branches or ones that you can't quite reach from the ground. And that should allow you to prune branches up to about 1.5 inches or so. Again, use a bypass, not an anvil lopper, and you should be able to take care of your own tools. So, heading cuts, cuts to make. There are 2 types of cuts employed in pruning fruit trees, heading and thinning cuts. A heading cut removes the end of a larger branch just beyond the smaller branch or just above a bud, as you can see where this person's about to cut, just above this fruit bud. This directs more energy into the smaller branch or bud to produce growth in a different direction or to stimulate the formation of fruit buds. Heading cuts are used to direct growth out away from the tree, as well as to shorten branches. These cuts, you can consider them suggestions for the pruner for how to make the tree grow in a certain direction. Sometimes the tree will comply, and sometimes it will direct energy into other branches or buds. If you've pruned for a long time, you know that they don't always grow in the direction you want them to, but generally they will. Heading cuts made just beyond a bud, as described here, tend to produce a proliferation of branches coming out from dormant buds and near the bud you want to stimulate. So if you cut this here over the year that follows, you may get lots of twigs coming out from these other buds you see below that cut. Remove the new branches you don't want to keep in the summer or in the following year. Cuts to a smaller branch don't tend to stimulate as many dormant buds to sprout, as long as the smaller branch is at least 1/3 to 1/2 the size of the larger branch in diameter. When making heading cuts, place the cut about 1/4 inch past the bud or smaller branch, cutting at an angle as shown. We're going to show you 2 quick videos making these cuts now. There we are, cutting the heading cut off very quickly. There you go. And there is a heading cut to a directional twig going this direction. So we're going to send that direction energy going in this direction rather than cutting it off. So back to where we were. I'm going to talk about thinning cuts. Thinning cuts remove a branch at its base where it meets the trunk or a larger branch. Let's see. These are used to create more space within the tree and to remove branches that are growing in the wrong direction, just as water sprouts or cross branches discussed previously. When removing a branch, remember to cut just past the branch collar. Don't leave a long stub and don't cut flush to the trunk. So in this picture, you can see we've highlighted this long branch, one of many, hard to see without the highlighting, but we're going to be thinning this out of the center here to open up for more space. So we'll be cutting just above where the pointer stick is pointing. So we, oops, a little bit. So we can open up a little more space here for the foliage and other branches to grow into. Now we're going to show you a short video of doing several thinning cuts in this sort of mess of stuff happening on the tree here. So here we're coming at this area of thickened growth, and dense growth in the middle here. Sometimes you have to reach over some things to get to others. Thinning out from the top here. Get a little more space for sunlight and air to move through there. Skipping the juicy bits so you don't have to see me grunting my way through that mess of foliage. There you go. So if a branch is large enough that the weight of it could cause it to fall, tearing off the bark below the branch you're trying to cut. And if you've done much pruning out in the woodlands here, you know that our native one-seed junipers are notorious for doing this. You try to start cutting a branch and the whole thing rips off and drags a bunch of the bark down off the bottom of this branch and pulls it off the trunk. That's where you would want to use what's called a 3-part cut to remove that branch. The first cut you make is an undercut a few inches along the branch out from the trunk or the larger branch that you're trying to cut away from, just in here, and that's going to stop any sort of tearing of bark that might happen from here. The second cut you make then is you're going to cut the main weight of the branch off. So this can be a cut you made any old how just to get the weight and the tanglement of this branch off. Get that one out of your way. And then your third cut, now that all the weight and difficulty of this branch is out of your way, you can come in here and make a very slow, careful cut, making sure to avoid the branch collar. And this is the cut you actually wanted to make in the first place, was to remove the branch. You can make a careful cut here without the weight being in your way. And you won't have the tearing problem since you already cut through here to reduce that problem. We are going to show you a video of me actually doing that live a little later on in this webinar, so you'll be able to see that too. So you will use both heading and thinning cuts to create and maintain the form of a tree and direct its growth over time. Once they're developed, you'll want to maintain the main bearing branches, cutting them back as needed to stimulate secondary branching and to control the size. Prune the secondary bearing branches and smaller branches to maintain fruit production, sunlight penetration, and shading. So in the early years, if branches are growing in places where you know they will ultimately be removed, but they're not causing any problems to branches you'll want to keep, you can cut these sort of temporary branches back halfway or so to let them keep producing energy to help the tree get rooted and grow on. So then after a few years, 1 or 2 years, you can remove those branches fully while they're still small. This is a technique that's also helpful if you're not really comfortable with pruning yet. You think probably that branch has to go, but I'm not just feeling sort of ready to do that myself yet. I don't know that I could take that branch off. And that way of reducing that branch buys you a little bit of time till you're feeling brave enough to take it off yourself. So, but the concept is that you want to try to get all those main bearing branches as much as possible in place while the tree is still young and you're making small cuts. And then later, as the tree's sort of growing into its fullness in 5 to 10 years, you're mostly doing the lateral cuts, not the big pruning cuts. It's a really useful way to come about pruning. So now we're going to talk about, now that you know all the cuts to make, you need to know when to make them. So working with the energy patterns of the tree by pruning at the right time helps trees seal those pruning cuts over properly. We talked about how trees heal, so doing it at the right time of year helps that happen best. It also helps create the best form and fruit production to do it in a timely way. In late summer and fall, trees start storing all that energy they produced all summer with all those healthy leaves. They start taking that energy and storing it all in the main trunks and down in the roots and the branches. So they've stored that all winter and they use that energy the following spring. They'll start putting that energy out to start their first production of flowers and leaf growth, as well as sealing off those wounds you made for pruning. So before they start doing that, you want to be able to prune them. So dormant pruning is a good way to do that. So pruning in late winter, just before the trees come out of dormancy, means the trees can start to seal off the pruning cuts quickly. If you prune in the fall or in early winter, that leaves those cuts open to winter injury longer. So winter injury, they could freeze if it gets way too cold, or they might be available for microorganisms, bacteria, pests, other diseases to get into the tree a little bit longer. Even if it's frozen, those things are out in the air. So you want to leave those wounds available to the air a little less time than as the least time possible. So to do it in late winter is a good time for that. Because the trees also stored energy to make new wood in the fall, the response to dormant pruning is often to produce a lot of growth from the area near the pruning cut. So you're cutting off energy they would have had, so they still have that energy stored, and they have a lot to put forth into the new growth in the spring. So that gives you a lot of choices to use in creating the form that you want. Another benefit of pruning during the dormant season is that it's easy to see the structure of the branches, as you can see here. Much easier to see what you're doing in this photo than perhaps in this photo where the leaves are hiding a lot of the activity of the tree. So dormant pruning in the Santa Fe area is usually best done between about mid-February through March or so. Don't prune when the temperature is below freezing. It's not good for the tree or for the person doing the pruning. Summer pruning is because summer pruning removes leaves, as this person is doing here, that would otherwise be producing energy to be stored for growth the following year. It's often used to help restrict the size of the tree once it starts to mature. This is best used for trees that are growing vigorously. Trees that are not growing well may be too stunted by summer pruning and should be left for dormant pruning only. Summer pruning is also used to remove water sprouts, suckers, and the small branches that need to be thinned out. Most summer pruning is directed to year-old or new shoots. A healthy tree is producing a lot of energy in the summer, so it can seal off pruning cuts quickly at this time. Removing some vegetative growth by shortening year-old branches can also help stimulate development of flowers and fruit spurs. Summer pruning is best done after the new leaves have hardened off and before the end of July, which gives you about halfway through May or so and good part of June, most of July to work. The stunting effect will be reduced if it's done too late in the season. Don't prune when the temperature is over 80 degrees or when trees are under drought stress. And the other time to prune is any time that you see dead, damaged, or diseased wood, that you don't have to wait for the proper season to do that. You're probably helping the tree by removing that as soon as you see that kind of wood. If you're cutting diseased branches, clean your pruners in between cuts before moving to another tree to keep from spreading the diseases. Use alcohol or non-bleach disinfectant wipes. You can use bleach, but it can damage the blades of your pruning tool. So we tend to recommend alcohol or other kinds of wipes instead. I use a small alcohol bottle that I just keep in my bucket with my other tools, and I use it between trees all the time. And now we're going to talk about tips. So tips could also be called how to approach your pruning job. So we're going to go back to the beginning and sort of go over all of this now. Before you start to prune, you want to spend time observing your tree. Walk around it a little bit and think into the future. How will the branches look as they grow? Are they going to be getting longer and thicker? Will they run into each other? Look at this tree, for example, all these branches here, imagining them a lot wider as they caliper up. Do some more of those have to go away? Are the bearing branches in the right place? How do you keep the form open enough while producing enough shade to prevent that sun scald we talked about? Which branches are heading in the wrong direction? Is it easier to take them off now, or do we need to wait 2 more years before they're really showing themselves? Which ones will be rubbing or producing too much shade as they grow? Are their branches growing too tight to the trunk, producing narrow crotches? Can I spread these branches to create better angles, or should I prune them off now? Are the branches growing down toward the ground? Should they be cut off? Where are the fruit spurs? These are the kinds of questions you want to ask yourself as you're walking around the tree, maybe more than one tree. Doing this exercise with a friend can sometimes be really helpful, especially if you haven't done a lot of pruning. You can even read through this list, talk it out together, see if you all, between the 2 or 3 of you, catch all these details. It's really useful to work through all of this before you even pick up your pruners. You can see all the details. And then start working on from the big down to the small. So for the apple tree we worked on during this presentation, Tracy and I first walked around the tree together, just like we talk about you all should do. We worked on it together, decided which branches to prune based on very vigorous growth we'd seen. You can see all this is all new stuff that happened here in the last couple of years because we had done some different grass planting in 2019. We think that allowed for a lot more root expansion, show the growth happened on top as well. So we can show the video now and show how it demonstrates a few of these different pruning techniques.
So when you're going to remove a branch, one of the things you can do to make it easier to get to it is simply start thinning out some of the wood that's in your way so you can more easily get to the branch to take it off. Doesn't matter that you're whacking these off, you're going to take the whole branch off. Now, when you're taking off a larger branch, you want to use a saw when you're getting to a branch this size, and you want to use the 3-cut method to keep it from falling off and tearing, from falling down, tearing the bark. So first you start out a little further. Let's go out far enough so it's real obvious. Start out a little further with an undercut. And you do an undercut here so that when the branch falls off, there's not so much weight. And then you come in a bit. Okay, yeah, you go out beyond the undercut and you cut the branch off. The undercut will stop any tearing from going down the trunk. You cut the main part of the branch off when you go out beyond the undercut, and then you take the final last piece off. And you want to be careful when you're doing this not to cut into the branch bark ridge. Remember, we talked about the branch bark ridge and the branch collar. You want to be sure not to cut into the branch collar, the branch bark ridge. Preserve those cells that are going to seal off the damage. Okay, that's a clean cut. And it's out from the trunk, but it doesn't leave a big stub, but it preserves the ring of cells in there, the branch collar, that will seal off this damage.
Tracy got to do a cameo on this talk after all. So we were able to show you a few different things. It's one of the largest branches we needed to take off that tree. So we started from the big and went down to the small. There were too many branches in that section of the trunk, so we were able to take some weight off that part of the trunk of the tree too. We talked about that earlier. And that branch and all the stuff attached to it, the smaller twigs attached to it, were growing towards the path and were going to be a problem within a year or two for people walking by that path. So we were able to take care of a lot of issues by removing that one large branch. Ideally, we would have seen all those coming and removed that branch a couple of years back before it was large, but we were able to get to it now instead of waiting farther into the future. Oops. So here now are those, the before and after shot of having pruned that branch off. So on this, the left side of your screen is before. So the right side, it's a little farther away, but you can see the bottom side of this tree is opened up some. You might not be able to tell it as well from the photograph, but there's a lot less weight on this part of the trunk now and a little less tanglement, so it's a little more open through the canopy of the tree now as well. So you may remember in the other videos that we also thinned out some of the branches higher up in the tree, in this part of the tree, to further open up the areas of the canopy. We also removed water sprouts, crossing branches, some branches heading down. You can see these down here are probably the ones that we removed. So we worked from the large going down to the small. So that's important for being efficient in your work. So you too can create a plan to prune efficiently in your trees. Remove the largest first, then the smaller, then the smallest. You don't want to get hung up on looking at one branch and taking all the little stuff off it, and before you step back and go, oh, I should have removed the whole branch first. So it's very important to just be sort of efficient and careful in your planning as well as in your actual practice of pruning. Let's see. So here now is the pile of branches on the right that we took off this apple tree on the left. This is the nearly finished tree. So it gives you a sense of all of the wood that was removed from this tree. So we estimated this at about maybe 15, maybe 20% at the most of the total mass of the original tree before it was pruned. So remember, you don't want to remove more than about 25 to 30% of the canopy of a young, healthy tree, much less than that if it's an older tree. So if you have an older tree, maybe you inherited a tree on your property and you don't know what to do with it, not start with small branches, but you want to start with taking off small amounts at a time. It's probably a several-year process. If you have an older tree that you want to rejuvenate into good fruit-bearing condition. So as we said before, older trees take longer to heal. So you just want to be judicious about how much at a time you take off. This tree was growing quite vigorously, so we don't feel bad at all about taking off this estimated 15 to 20% of the wood this year. But you want to keep track of how much of the wood you're removing as you work. If I'd gotten to this point and we're still working, I'd still want to look back at the tree and say, maybe I should think about slowing down, because you want to prune slowly and methodically. And remember, you can always take more wood. Sorry, you can always take off more, but you can't put it back on again. So rule of thumb, always in pruning, can't put it back on again. Only time can do that. So pruning is an ongoing process and doesn't happen in just one season. You want to observe the tree's responses to your pruning, let that guide you the next year. Some of the things you do are going to make it put out a lot more wood. Some of the things you do are going to stall it in its tracks. We hope that what you do is going to make it a healthier, more productive tree. So if you're lucky, you get to keep working with the same trees year after year and see how they respond to your work. Here's the final before and after. Here's our apple tree about a month ago. Here it was taken about, I think about 10 days ago or so. Ready to flower in about 3 weeks and have fruit maybe in about 6 months. These are very good productive trees when we didn't get a frost. We got a late frost last year, but they've had wonderful fruit except for those years. Well-pruned trees will reward you with beautiful flowers and delicious fruit through the years, except for the years when we get late frosts. Last year it was April 20th. We live in the mountains, so that can always happen. We thank you for attending, and I think we have time to answer questions if you all have any. Really appreciate you being here and supporting the Botanical Garden. Hope you enjoyed this talk, and let us know if you have any questions.
Thank you, Linda. That was a great presentation, and we do have a few questions here. So if you take a sip of water, and
sure.
One of the viewers wanted to know, and I'll try to describe this right. She's asked, can you influence the direction of growth based upon the angle of the prune?
Not the angle that you're cutting off, if I'm understanding that right. The direction of the growth is going to depend on what direction on the stem is the bud just below where you're cutting. Let me see if I can go back and find a picture that'll show that. I'm gonna hope we can do that. Might have to go back a ways. Yeah, here. So if you look at, I'm hoping that my mouse will show you what I'm talking about. the pruner is pointing to, it looks like this little tiny bud here, but it's actually above this bud. This bud here is coming out sort of towards us, the viewers. This is going to determine the direction of growth. The growth is probably going to come out towards us a little bit of a direction. I'd say maybe that's 9 o'clock or so. That's going to influence the direction of growth, not whether the angle of the cut is 45 degrees or 90 degrees or straight across, if that is what you meant by that question.
I think so.
Okay.
If that wasn't answered completely, just resubmit another follow-up.
Yes, please.
There were a couple of questions about sun scald.
Okay.
And so let's just review that. Could you describe for everyone, what do you paint over the sun scald and cut? And there was another one, let's see. Is there a preferred time to paint on? They say latex here, but do you just paint it over?
It's the preferred time is before it happens, preferably. It doesn't matter that much when. If you have a new tree, you want to get it before winter. It can happen. The tree can get sunburnt any time of year, but sun scald happens when the bark is frozen. Actually, the liquid under the bark in the cambium is frozen, and the liquid is mostly water. And as you all know from your high school chemistry classes, water is the one thing that expands when it goes from a solid into a liquid. Most things condense, get smaller. So the liquid inside the bark of the tree is mostly water, and it's frozen in the winter. But during our nice warm winter days, it can get up, because the bark is a dark color and we might not have any snow in the ground. It might get up to 60 degrees or so some winter days. And even if it's not that warm in temperature, the bark is warm, so it can warm up considerably. And so that makes the liquid, the frozen liquid, sorry, the ice turn to frozen, thawed liquid or water inside the bark of the tree. And so it starts running. And then that night it gets down to below freezing again. It might get down considerably below freezing. And so the part of the stuff that's inside the bark that was liquid now freezes. Because it's mostly water, it expands. That expansion of that liquid just underneath the bark cracks the bark. That's the damage. So when that happens day after day, or you could say night after night after night on thin, tender bark, the little tiny cracks become bigger cracks. That's the problem with sun scald. You're actually making lots and lots of little cracks in the tender bark, and the cracks become bigger. And so you can look at almost any young fruit tree that hasn't been otherwise protected in northern New Mexico, and it's going to have open, it kind of looks like open scabs or something like that on the tree. That sounds terrible, but it'll look like open areas that are not contiguous all the way around the bark. So that's the sun scald.
And what do you paint on it? What do you apply? What's the paint that you put on it?
The application, you can either cover it. There's all kinds of different coverings. People make white plastic things you can wrap around the bark. You can cover it with, looks like this brown kind of corrugated paper. You can even just put brown paper bags around it for the winter. What that does, it keeps it from getting too warm. That's what you're trying to do. The paint does that really effectively. So you mix white latex paint. I think it's that kind that's used for outdoors because it lasts a little longer. Mix that half and half with water. Paint that on the bark, and you want to paint it on the bark like from the bottom branch down and a little farther up than that. And then probably you can paint it on some of the main branches going up too. You can do all the way around, but mostly what you want to hit the paint is on the south and southwest sides of the main branches and the trunk. And once you've painted it on, it'll probably stay on that trunk and branches a couple of years. It'll start flaking off after a couple of years. It does not hurt the tree. It'll look kind of funny, especially once it starts flaking. I've had clients call me worried about some white flaky stuff they saw on their trees. And when I went to look at it, it was paint that had been painted on by nurseries. So what it does is, because it's a light color, it keeps the tree from getting as warm during the warm parts of our winter days. And so then it doesn't go through that freeze thaw process. It's just a, basic reaction thing. So.
Okay. And so you
answer those questions.
You suggest doing that before the sun scald occurs. And if it has occurred, you can go ahead and apply it on top of the damage.
Right.
Okay.
It'll prevent further damage. Once your tree is, been in the ground a few years and the bark has gotten thicker, it's not going to continue getting worse. Most of the damage has probably already happened, especially on the trunk and the bigger branches. You might still keep getting a little sun scald on the newer, thinner branched branches or thinner barked branches.
Okay. So. And could you describe you're referring to, our seasons in winter. One viewer wanted to know when exactly is late winter in Santa Fe?
Well, that's a good question because it's different from year to year. Late winter, if you're asking specifically when we should prune, being late winter, it can be anything from mid-February to mid-April. You want to prune before the tree buds on the trees start swelling a lot, ideally, because then it's starting to use up the energy that it had stored. So you want to prune things off of the tree before it start using the energy that it has stored, because you're cutting into its energy reserves then, ideally. So ideally you would prune up until that starts happening, and you have several weeks when you can do that. You can prune in the middle of winter, but as I said in the talk, it's just more time that the tree is left unhealed, basically, or unsealed. So I usually start pruning about mid-February and up until about maybe the first week of April.
Okay. We have a few different questions about spraying, but before we get to that, frost protection for dwarf trees, what kind of material do you cover it with?
Frost protection. I don't generally cover things because it tends to create more damage than you saved. Whenever I've tried to cover anything for frost protection, I end up breaking a lot of twigs and buds off. So you can, if it's a very small tree and you think you can cover it without breaking very much, you can use this stuff called rime, or that white kind of fake fabric looking stuff that's not woven. It's also used for frost protection on like crop covers on the ground. And just drape that carefully around the tree and maybe try to tie it gently around the trunk. A better idea might have to do with where you plant your tree in the first place. Plant it someplace that doesn't get too warm too early in the season. So on the north side of a house or the northeast side of a house where it stays colder a little bit longer into the spring, so it doesn't start warming up too early, is a good idea. If you have the option of doing that. If you're thinking about planting a fruit tree but haven't done it yet, plant it in an area where it doesn't warm up as early in the spring. It's a good idea. So you want to plant it where it's going to get sun eventually in the summer, but that stays cold a little longer into the spring. If that makes sense. So you don't want your buds swelling too early in the spring.
Okay. Okay, so some questions about what to spray on trees after pruning, such as dormant oil. Do you recommend that, or do you
Don't
wait?
recommend spraying anything for pruning. If you want to spray, it's a separate issue from what you were pruning. Pruning is for form and the other things we talked about today. If you're spraying, for example, dormant oil, it's because you might be trying to control some kind of pests on the trees. That might be for codling moth if you know you have it on your apples, or
that's exactly what some of the questions are about.
Yeah, if you know you have it, then you might want to spray for it, but I believe the spraying for that is a little later in the spring. It's not quite this early. Most things you don't spray quite this early in the season. So.
And would that be dormant oil that you would spray?
You can spray dormant oil for that, but it's a little later in the season than now. So.
Okay. Also, let's see here. Any recommendations to avoid, I think people are worried about pests, to avoid worms in the fruit?
Find out what worms you think you might have first. There's not really good generic treatments. There's a couple wormy things that almost everybody gets sooner or later if they're growing, especially apples in Santa Fe. Codling moth is one of them. I can't remember the name of the other one. but they tend to come on in June. And you know, one of the best things to do is get pheromone traps for them when you know you have them, and then treat accordingly. I don't do really generic spraying because I don't like spraying trees unless I absolutely have to. So you can check in with the county extension agent about if they know that there's certain things that we have around Santa Fe. I don't do any spraying, for example, at the botanical gardens. I may have to soon because I did see a few codling moths last year, but so far we have a 9-year-old orchard. We have not had anything but a few codling moths so far. For peaches and plums, you may get, sorry, the name of it is escaping me. It's a big fat ugly grub that gets in from the bottom, right at where the trunk meets the soil. And there's something, you can plant chives or onions right at the base of the tree, and that keeps that from getting in. Peach tree borers, I guess they're called. They're just really gross. So
Yeah.
I think something in the onion family planted at the base of the tree can be helpful. So.
Okay, a couple more pruning questions. One question is, I moved into a house with fruit trees that don't seem to have been pruned. They're probably several years old, younger than 12, older than 2. The branch angles are more acute. Can I train the branches to grow laterally?
If they're already in place and fairly established, like they're woody, they're not flexible anymore, you can't train those specific branches to grow out more, but you might be able to prune so that laterals off those branches might be able to take the place of them over time. You might be stuck with those, in which case you try to get small laterals off those uprights to be the fruit-bearing smaller branches. It might be a case of, as I was alluded to a little bit towards the end of the talk, you might just need to do a little bit of rejuvenation pruning. They're not 12 years old, isn't too old of a tree. So over a couple of years time, you might need to rejuvenate prune so that you, over maybe 2 or 3 years, replace those upright branches with new ones you get to grow out a little bit further. So.
Good strategy. Do you have a good suggestion for a prune saw?
Pruning saw. I wish I had mine with me to show you. There's really great ones made by Silky, like Silky Fabric is the way, S-I-L-K-Y. They're Japanese saws. They make a lot of different ones. I don't know that they're available locally. You can get them online, but there's some really good basic ones you can get here. Corona, I believe, is the brand, like Crown Corona. And there's one that's about maybe 14 inches long that's slightly curved, and I'm pretty sure they sell those at the local nurseries. And I've had a great time with it. I do almost all my pruning with it. It's a little bit of a wider blade, so that would be for some of the bigger branches. And smaller stuff, I hardly ever need to use a saw. If it's less than about 1.5 inches around, if the pruning that you're doing is on branches less than 1.5 inches around, usually either a lopper or a pair of hand pruners can deal with it. So a good larger saw for the larger work, and loppers and pruners. Those 3 tools that I showed you are really almost all that I use on fruit trees. For other kinds of tree work, you might want a larger variety of saws.
Okay, just a couple of last questions. If there's any others, please put them in. Do you have any recommendations for mulches or food for dwarf peaches?
Mulches are, yes, mulching is a great idea for fruit trees for a few different reasons. I would use some kind of coarse woody mulch. Bark mulch nowadays is not considered the best if it's actual bark. So something that's kind of coarse and more woody than not. So it can let air and water and air oxygen penetrate. And you want to sort of scurf it up about twice a year so it doesn't get really packed down. And you should get a good like 4-inch layer of mulch and have it out as far as the drip line of the tree. So the stuff, if you're in Santa Fe, if you have a ways to go get some of the stuff from the Buckman area, they have some great woody mulch up there you can get for very nominal fee. If not that, there's a number of different kinds of mulches you can get from almost all of the nurseries. And if you want to put a layer of good quality compost down. You can do that about once. If your tree is in pretty good shape now, putting a little bit of compost down, like up to 1/2 inch to 1 inch of compost down first, and then the mulch on top of that, that's a really good fertilizer for the trees. I tend to not want to over fertilize trees too much, because I think if they're healthy, they're probably in good balance with the systems. If the tree is not healthy, you should probably get a soil test by taking a little bit of soil, finding out from the county extension agent, again, where's a good place to send in your soil to get it tested. I hate to just throw fertilizer on soil if you don't know exactly what's wrong with it, what nutrients you need. You could use Yum Yum Mix, which is sort of the standard that everybody uses for everything around here. It wouldn't hurt. But if you think there's something that your soil needs, it's better to get an accurate soil test for it. But compost is sort of the thing that can't hurt and helps everything. So compost with mulch over it is really great. The mulch will keep the weeds down, keep the soil better watered, and the tree will love you for it. So.
See if you can recognize this. The volunteer plums on an acequia have very long, thin branches.
Oh, yeah.
Not many close to the big branch. Do you have suggestions?
Volunteer plums, yeah, they tend to do that, don't they? It might be that they're growing in too much shade. They tend to grow as an understory under other trees, and that'd be why they might just be reaching out, trying to get into the sun. You could, over time, if they seem to be healthy otherwise, bring those branches back like several inches at a time, year by year, and see if they'll still put out foliage and keep growing. That's the best I could tell you without looking at the plum and seeing what else is going on with them. So if they're in a lot of shade, they're going to keep growing until they get to the sun, and that's just the situation they're in.
Okay, last but not least, we were just talking about this. Will you be discussing rose pruning?
We were just talking about that. We will probably do a rose pruning workshop of some sort. We almost always do a live one at the Botanical Gardens. I don't know if we're going to do one on Zoom this year, so stay tuned. It's the best I can do right now.
Right.
The Master Gardeners always does ones too. Always does one in the spring. So.
That's a good suggestion. Well, that completes all of our questions. And so thank you so much. This was very helpful and informative. And please, everyone that registered, all the members, everyone who gave donations, thank you so much.
Yes, thank you.
Send us suggestions for future programs, and we hope we will see you in the garden soon. Please come and visit. On April 1st, our hours and days will expand. So there will be more opportunities, and we do have a monthly community day as well. So please check our website, follow us on all the social media channels, sign up for our newsletter. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for coming. Have fun pruning.